Make no mistake, that which is canceled today will be criminalized tomorrow. This provocative statement is from the upcoming book, No Reason to Hide, by Dr. Erwin Lutzer. The book's subtitle, Why Bible-Believing Christians Must Stand for Truth in a Darkening Culture, could be a slogan for what we believe here at FRC and Washington Watch. Now, this book deals with 10 pressure points at which believers clash with the culture and proclaims we must speak with compassionate clarity about the issues of the day. Joining me now to discuss his upcoming book is Dr. Erwin Lutzer. He's the pastor emeritus and formerly senior pastor of the Moody Church in Chicago for 36 years. Dr. Lutzer, great to have you today.
I'm so glad to be with you. And of course, the work that you are doing is so critical. Christians have to realize that even though we are gospel-centered, the simple fact is that people today are looking for answers, and we have to help them think through the issues that they are facing. And that's why I wrote the book that you referenced entitled No Reason to Hide.
Well, you are very kind, and we are indeed endeavoring today and every day to help people think a bit more clearly about a world that is indeed very confusing. And I want to talk about some of the great points that you make in your book. And one of the things that you say to start this off is you say that today those who claim to be tolerant actually seek to be dominant. What do you mean by that?
Well, the simple fact is the word tolerance has many different meanings, and in the minds of the left, tolerance does mean dominance. If you don't come along with their agenda, they will call you intolerant. And of course, what they don't recognize is that they are intolerant. They are unwilling to accept a different viewpoint, and that's why I discuss such things, of course, as the cancel culture. More than that, speaking of dominance, I point out today that if you were to ask for a job or apply for a job, even if it's teaching chemistry in a university, you would be asked whether or not you feel comfortable with the whole LGBTQ agenda. Are you comfortable with multiple pronouns? So the culture has certain cultural streams, and those who claim to be tolerant are the ones that are intolerant of anyone who doesn't go along with their agenda.
I think there are many examples of that. In your experience, Dr. Lutzer, how did this come to be?
Well, we often talk about cultural Marxism, but it is really true. Cultural Marxism says that we can bring about a Marxist country if we capture the institutions of the United States, such as education, the arts, the media, the values, and so forth. And so what you have is, this has been being taught in the universities in our country for a long time. It now filters down to the reality that parents are facing in terms of schools. I make the point that a teacher here in the school system of Chicago told me that it was not necessary, he said, for him to only tolerate same-sex marriage. If he didn't celebrate it, he might lose his job. Now, that's a line in the sand. And what we have to do is to help Christians to stand in and say, I will not go and cross that line.
Dr. Lutzer, you use the term cultural Marxism. We've heard that thrown about in a lot of dialogue. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, it is the seeping in of Marxism, but not the kind of Marxism in Russia, which brought about a revolution, or in China, but the slow march through all the institutions. And that's what we see happening today. And of course, words are misused. I have an entire chapter on how language is misused today. Let's take the word equality. You have equality is a perfectly good word, but what you do is you have it applied to marriage equality. Well, you and I know that those are two things that are not equal. It's not equal to say that two men living together are a marriage, but in our world today, language is used in order to propagate an agenda. So what we have to do, according to them, is to tear down our history, vilify the United States, and then build a whole new system based on a humanistic/Marxist worldview. And, it's so important in these literatures that are being written in these things. There is never a comparison with America to other countries. It's hard to get people to hate America if you compare it with other countries. Yeah. So America is vilified, and that, of course, is what causes a lot of university students to go the wrong direction. So it's the revamping of culture along Marxist lines.
And to try to get a bit more clarity on that, how would you distinguish between something that you would describe as cultural Marxism as compared to something that you just think is a bad idea?
Well, first of all, let me say that ideas have consequences, and you've heard it said, bad ideas have bad consequences. The reason that we can sometimes can't distinguish between a bad idea and Marxism is because many people who accept Marxist ideas that are bad do not necessarily trace it to Marx. And so we must recognize that it is the way in which the culture is set up. We have a lot of bad ideas out there, but I need to emphasize an idea does not need to work in order for it to survive. It only has to sound good. And that's why Marxism has survived. And as I say, it filters down in race. I have 2 chapters in my book on race. It filters down in our understanding of language. I just want to throw this in. One of the universities that I quote has a language code, and it says that you can't use the word freshman, you can't use victim. It goes on to ban certain words. And then it says if there is a barbershop in your area, don't say that he takes in walk-ins because it might offend those who can't walk, those who are in the wheelchair. Now, what's the purpose of this? The purpose is not to elevate the conversation. The purpose is to silence the conversation. You have no idea what's appropriate. And so there are various ways, and Marx would be totally in favor of that. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that Marx was so opposed to freedom of speech because the capitalists would always take advantage of it. So what he is saying is it's time for those who have traditional values to be quiet, and now it's time for the oppressed to speak. And the way we treat you is we silence you by these kinds of codes. So I know we've gone around a lot of different topics here, but there is coherence. Marxism basically says we have to destroy the foundations of Christianity and the foundations of capitalism, and everything needs to be rebuilt and on a Marxist humanistic foundation.
Talking to Dr. Erwin Lutzer about his book, No Reason to Hide. And Dr. Lutzer, you've talked about all of these bad ideas, and this may be an impossible question to answer, but of all the bad ideas that you see floating about in the ideological ecosystem, do you have a sense of which one is the worst or most harmful idea?
Oh, yes, the most harmful is the whole transgender phenomenon. Definitely. And one of the things that parents need to do is to be able to speak to their children about this. I think it is the worst bad idea because it is destroying our young people. You see, even young people, because we're created in God's image, have a sense of right and wrong. So they go to school, they're introduced to pornography. As a matter of fact, I have a discussion of that, particularly here in the state of Illinois, but elsewhere as to what is being taught. They're introduced to all kinds of perverse ideas regarding sexuality. So what happens? They feel guilty, they feel shame, they don't know where to turn, they are empty inside. And so somebody says, you know what the answer is to your problem? You must be trans. And so the boy who's born Bert, goes to school and says, well, I'm going to be called Bertha. And we are expected to go along with that. I have to emphasize this. I know our time is so limited, but in George Orwell's book, 1984, Winston is taken to a back room and is taught that 2 + 2 is equal to 5. Sometimes it is equal to 3, and sometimes it is both. Now, Joseph, let's think about that. I don't think that they actually thought that they could persuade him that 2 + 2 was equal to 5. They wanted him, however, to be comfortable with living with lies. Everybody knows that a man can't have a baby. Everybody knows that. But nonetheless, we're supposed to be comfortable in a society that's living by lies. And while I'm talking, Voltaire is quoted as saying that he who gets you to believe absurdities can eventually get you to commit atrocities. So we'd better know where the lines are drawn and what we believe about these issues.
I think you make a really powerful point there, that the point of this is not necessarily to convince people that false things are true, but to simply be silent in the face of the statement of false things and to act and behave as if they are true. Now, Dr. Lutzer, there's so much that you get into in this book. You pose a lot of questions for the church to consider in the culture that we live in, one of which is, will our children be indoctrinated by the enemy? I'd like to hear your perspective on the role you think education plays in what we're dealing with culturally, and what the right way for the church to respond to the education dilemma is.
Well, first of all, you asked about cultural Marxism a little while ago. Marx believed, and Lenin was equally clear, that education is too important a job to leave to parents. So as a result, they believed not in public schools, but state-sponsored schools. Why? So that the children would learn not to be oppressed, because after all, the family has to be destroyed because men oppress their wives, parents oppress their children, they take them to church. God, of course, is the ultimate oppressor. So education, therefore, has now fallen into the hands of leftists. And I want to say to the parents, and this speaks directly to your issue, God is going to hold you accountable for the education of your children. And that's why I advocate strongly, if possible, perhaps they should be homeschooled. There are also faith-based schools. If that is impossible, what you need to do is to make sure that you stay on top of what they're being taught in our public schools, because it does depend on the school. There's still some public schools who believe in relative amount of decency and core values. Right. But you need to stay on top of that, because someday God is going to hold you accountable for that. And our greatest legacy is going to be lived out in our children. My heart breaks. I weep for the children of this nation.
Dr. Lutzer, you also, in your book, talk about the fact that Christians need to accept the blessing of suffering. And you talk about that as part of discipleship. Why do you think that's so important today?
Because the average American believes this, that if we were really faithful to God, we'd always live with freedom. We'd have governments that are supportive of Christianity and so forth. Well, we've had that in the past, but I have to say that when you study church history, that kind of an arrangement is very rare. Church history is filled with a suffering church. And what I say in that chapter is we have to rethink this, and we have to come to the conclusion that indeed, correctly understood, suffering for Christ can be a blessing. Listen to the words of Jesus. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Great is your reward, for so persecuted they the prophets that were before you. The Apostle Paul says, to this you were called, not only to believe in him, we love that part, but also to suffer for his name. So we as Americans who've had it so easy, relatively speaking, we need to rethink what suffering for Jesus Christ really means and suffer well, because actually, as I show, it becomes a stepping stone to a
Dr.
new
Lutzer?
kind of gospel witness.
Unfortunately, I must cut you off because we are out of time. He is Dr. Lutzer. The book is No Reason to Hide. Pick it up. It is fascinating and encouraging. Thanks for your time.